Wrapping up today, we follow the red thread of U.S. imperialism to Africa. Back to Africa, one might say. Netfa Freeman is an organizer with Pan-African Community Action, and he sat down with us recently to discuss Pan-African issues and the neo-colonialist scramble for Africa, which here in the U.S. is known as AFRICOM. Take a look.
African American actually, its history doesn't, the earliest coining of it was like Jesse Jackson saying we're African American. It's in response really to us coming to the conclusion over time and struggle that we're African people. So in a way, it's a kind of a subversion of that re-identifying with the continent, the mother continent, and not just saying, oh, we're African people because we came from there and that's our heritage, but that our circumstances, our condition is actually has a correlation with the people on the continent of Africa and other people of African descent around the world. So in the United States, and this is in the U.S. Tries to do this with this chauvinism, not just to black people, but everyone. We're American. We share common interests, economic, social, our heritage, history, all that, when it's really not true. I mean, there's some things that we share as people who are here, but there's some of that stuff that we share is also contentious, and it's also a disregard for where we come from and what kind of also where we've made connections with each other transcontinentally. So anyway, so some of us have rejected African American and want to reclaim us as African people. African American, I would say, are those who don't really want to separate from the paradigm that is known as America, which is also have some chauvinism to it because this is a continent, and it's not just the people are not just America is not just the people in the United States, but they don't want to separate from the United States, so they want to say, well, we're American and our interests are bound up with the betterment of what is America or the United States, which also the foundation of that is settler colonialism, exploitation, all that kind of stuff. So if we want to reject that, African people here have used black and African interchangeably, those of us who are political and who embrace Africa. And Pan-Africanism, that term refers to either a movement or ideological or philosophical framework that embraces that. So it's like we have a Pan-African movement. We can say the Pan-African movement, those things that have happened over time that constitute the actions and the motion, the economic cooperation, the capturing of our history and our heritage that qualify us as a one people, and that's Pan-Africanism.
Listening to you speak and reading some of your work, it's clear that you're focusing on the global issues that affect Black and African folks. So we're going to get into AFRICOM, but I do want to touch on the connectivity of these freedom struggles around the world. Why do you feel that it's vital to focus on a borderless movement rather than that, United States Black or African movement?
That's a good question. The short answer is that the forces that dominate the world operate borderlessly. They operate what we call transnationally. And so we can't, and they've been doing that on some level for us for a long time. If you talk about African people, so the first cooperation between the European powers that dominated the continent of Africa was in the 1800s with the Berlin Conference. And then, even now. So that's why it's important, and that it's also consistent with what we've already forged in terms of resistance and trying to build an alternative future. So that's also transcontinentally. Anything less takes us backwards, to try to confine ourselves here and only think that how we could overcome forces that are global is to take away our power to be able to do so, take away unity, courses of unity that go outside of the confines of these borders. And so it's just important. I mean, the economy is just the global economy. That's how we're exploited, and so we have to respond on that level.
Right. And another thing that echoes that is you mentioned in a recent talk that while the FBI was implementing COINTELPRO here, the CIA was undermining African social justice movements, at the same time. And what you said about that was colonization isn't about geography, it's about relationships.
Mm-hmm. And so we're kind of taught, particularly in this country, which I can only speak pretty much for here, but I'm sure it goes with all of the colonizing countries or places. They teach colonialism in a very sterilized way. You almost don't even get a sense of the horrors and also the infrastructure of it. So the primary situation, the primary nature of it is not about the distance between those who are exploited and the metropole, which benefits from wherever the exploited place colony is or the exploited area is. It can be right. The metropole can be right next to you or within you, all within the center of it. But the dominant or the most important aspect of that relationship is the power, the ability to dictate the terms of political and economic and social control over a people. And so we have to recognize that. If we don't recognize it, then they can fool us into think that when they have drone warfare in Somalia, we'll be saying things like, "Oh, we don't agree with what we're doing to the Somalis." No, we are Somalis. Right. It's tantamount to the same thing of when the U.S. or when the forces in Philadelphia and the government dropped the bomb on the state of Move. I mean, we have to see these things as the same because they are ultimately. Same thing with Libya. Oh, the NATO and U.S. action, what they did in Libya is not right. No, we are Libyans. What we did in Libya, because people will talk like that, and we say, "Well, we're Libyans." No, they didn't do that. We didn't do that to them. They did that to us. And it's a very important distinction. It's not just semantics, and it's a mentality that we have to develop, a mentality and a philosophy that we have to develop that helps us concretize and realize who the enemy is, who our adversaries are that are oppressing us. And so we're not creating divisions. We're actually recognizing the divisions that already exist.
So I want to shift to another aspect of that sort of borderless paradigm. At a recent event that was from Gaza, D.C., with regards to the fight for freedom in between those two places, there was a connection that was made between the displacement of Palestinian folks there and the displacement of Black folks here in the States. I was wondering if you could touch a little bit more on that idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we know. I mean, I think that I guess the levels of severity of the material circumstances in the two places may differ. I think the Palestinian people, by virtue, experience a more severe and violent repression when it comes to the occupation and whatnot. But here, we're seeing the same kind of thing. So as the economy changes and then it takes over, one needs to take over certain geographical areas because of the trend in movement and migration of people and classes of people. The people who are most oppressed and most economically disadvantaged are displaced. Mm-hmm. And then to facilitate that displacement, they use all forms of things that are not just about redlining or denying us access to jobs or anything. They also take the place of forms of enforcement by police, criminalizing things that are not crimes, or intensifying the repression that we experience at the hands of law enforcement and the agents of repression, which causes people to either move out or just simply locking us up, mass incarceration. These are all things exactly identical to what the Palestinian people face. And when you lock up people, and people have to understand, you're breaking up families, you're making it hard for people to survive in terms. So it does when they incarcerate people. When people are incarcerated, it's not just the person who's incarcerated that suffers. It's everyone that they're connected to as a unit, a survival unit and family.
Yeah, and then also that concept, it's not just about, things like gentrification. For instance, the return rate of Black folks into the lower Ninth Ward after Hurricane Katrina hit was less than 50%, which is a way to, again, force people out. So we're looking at, gentrification, but also just natural disasters due to climate change and, of course, corporate sacrifice zones that are predominantly Black and brown communities. And I also wanted to shift now into AFRICOM. Another thing, when you mentioned how they teach colonization, they also teach it like, oh, that's just something that happened before, and it's not a thing that happens anymore, which is, of course, ridiculous. AFRICOM is basically a new scramble for Africa. It's neo-colonization, an effort aimed at imperialist control over the political landscape and, of course, natural resources as well. So talk a little bit about what's really going on there, because, of course, some folks might be like, oh, well, yeah, we're fighting terrorism, right? That's what we're doing, which is, of course, the veil. That's what we wrap it in. But talk about what's really going on with AFRICOM.
First, we have to realize or look at things, examine things through the, through the angle of how global economy works, and also the natural path of neoliberalism and capitalism. And so right now, and then so we look at that, we see that there's, in this system, those of us who are subjected to it, and some people who even benefited from it, there's a natural shrinking of the economy, inevitably shrinking of the economy. There's a whole lot less things being produced, particularly things that are about our survival and our well-being. There's all kind of things that people don't need, and a lot of wealth is also transferred by just international financial exchange and things like that. And so as a result of that, then we, I guess we could say, as a human family, there are, if economies and wealth and accumulation of wealth is based at some point, and this is where the contradiction comes in, is if it's based at some point with the ability for regular people to consume, then you have less people who can consume if people are jobless and they're in prison and all those kind of things. So there's not what would be considered development. In other countries, and countries around the world, because the U.S. and even the West as it is not the only player in the world, obviously. So there's other alternative economies, other people coming to be dominant on the scene of the global economy, like China, like all kind of things that have a different model when it comes to production and the development of the economy. That model is proven, and I'm not trying to say it's perfect or there's something. Well, there's obviously lessons from everything. But the point is, that's not really the point. The point is, it's competing with the United States. Yeah. Its ability to compete on the African continent in particular. And this also goes into the history of between China and the liberation struggles on the continent. Completely different histories between China and the liberation on the struggles on the continent in Africa, on the U.S. and Africa. Like you mentioned, when I mentioned before that when the liberation struggles on the continent were taking place, the U.S. and other European Western powers were trying to undermine them. In China, when it was also dealing with its own decolonization, it was an ally to the liberation struggles. That's another that foundational history is different. Now we're seeing where China in one place and other countries too are able to develop economies and compete in terms of economic influence and trade agreements and all those kind of things with different places in the world, particularly in Africa, whether we consider them beneficial for the continent of Africa or not. They might have their problems. The United States doesn't have those kind of agreements. What they have done and to enforce their economic hegemony has been pure dominance, straight up, military warfare, or dangling aid. The manipulation of aid as the carrot and the stick paradigm. And so they're using aid as it's what Kwame Nkrumah, first president of Ghana, and the scientific theorists for Pan-Africanism and revolution referred to as neocolonialism. And I think people should read this book, and it needs some, we need to examine what he came up with then or how his observations then and update them, but it's still the foundation. And it's a book called Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. And so in that, we can see now that the United States is trying to get a better footing than it had before, is having to figure out ways, particularly on the African continent, to compete with the rest of the globe in terms of how it's getting access to the raw minerals in the markets on the continent of Africa. So on the continent of Africa, Africa itself is the richest continent on the earth when it comes to mineral resources. But yet the people are the poorest on the face of the earth, and that has to do with the history of colonialism and enslavement and all that. But those resources are still very important, the raw minerals. So there's no industries that are developed there where they can actually refine, or we can actually refine our minerals into finished goods and finished things that we can export to the world. Those are all expropriated, and what we refer to as the rape of Africa. And now with now this neo-colonial stage, countries like China and whatnot are able to make agreements for their own benefit economically to get a foothold in these same ways. And then I'm sorry. Before, let me go back. Part of that is also not just extracting the raw minerals, but also being able to sell back the finished goods of these same raw minerals to the continent. So the local economies and the markets are depleted and are just crippled. They're not really able to do anything. And so where China there might be some of that same stuff where they're getting access to raw materials, but in order to do it, it hasn't been dominant. It's been developing certain things, infrastructure, which people could argue is not the most beneficial infrastructure internal to the country, but at least that's what they're doing. If they're building roads, you're building schools, that's a road and school the continent didn't have before, Whereas everything that the United States does has been historically to facilitate things, just naked gangsterism, taking it from the continent, overthrowing, assassinating leaders. This is the history and the legacy of the United States on the continent. Even now, through U.S. Agency for International Development and organizations like supposedly non-governmental, like the National Endowment for Democracy, or these kind of formations, they manipulate what we refer to as civil society movements and organizations by funding them. Of course, those funds come with, whether they're unspoken or not, conditions and strings attached. Means you have to be friendly to Western interests. You can't be talking about U.S. imperialism and all that and expect to get funds, help from the USAID, which keeps it dependent, and then also manipulates the people on the ground to not really understand who their enemies are, or be able to, at some point, establish what we used to have during the liberation struggle called the non-aligned movement, where countries, they were struggling against they were newly struggling for independence and against colonialism, decided that they did not want to be pawns in the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and said, well, we will establish the non-aligned movement, come together, realize our own interests, and deal with these entities on our own terms based on what we want and feel, and not be saying we'll have to pledge allegiance to any of them. And so we have to be able to build something else like that will put us on a stronger footing in the continent of Africa. And so I'm sorry, I'm almost digressed, but your question also was about AFRICOM. And so because the United States cannot have the type of relationships the entity like China has, it has to resort to trying to put military bases around and whatnot. And because of the very unstable situation that the continent finds itself in terms of the scarcity of resources and the chaoticness in terms of who is able to control resources, they can have the veil of Islamic extremism and things like this. Well, the problem is not a religion like Islam. The problem is the scarcity of resources and the ability for people to kind of come together and unite in order to decide what happens to what we have and how to manage what we have. So the United States is there to kind of enforce that people can't come together, whether they, so they can't come together and try to sort of establish things on their own terms. So we hear things like civilian casualties. The Amnesty International just came out with this report. I don't know if you know that says that the United States, the military defense, U.S. defense, was wrong in saying that drone strikes were not killing civilians, right?
Mostly kill civilians.
Right. So now, but then what we don't, and we didn't need Amnesty International to tell us that this was the case, but where the confusion comes in, this is where media and even these reports play into it to some extent, is we don't really define or really understand what their definitions are of enemy combatants and civilians. If you in your country, you don't feel like people should be there and you're trying to resist, then you can be an enemy combatant. You want to resist that. And so you're an enemy combatant to the invaders and you get classified as that. And you can be targeted by drones or anything else. So that's the other thing, is how do we, not accept the terms and the definitions by the enemy so that we understand clearly what's going on. So the problem, the problems are not like Islamic extremists or anything. The problem is radicalized elements who can't, don't want to accept what's going on, or even have to, by survival, have to struggle and compete, and don't have ideological direction. And so they cause harm to civilians, to innocent people, or people who are just their own. They cause harm to each other. Let's put it that way. And and it's not being defined as that. It's being defined in these very sterilized terms that don't help people understand the nature of what's going on.
Yeah, and the nuance of the situation, and like there's a kind of a it's not really a joke, but how do you know that they were enemy combatants? Well, they were in the strike zone. How do you know it's a strike zone? Because there were enemy combatants there, and it's like, okay.
That's
but
the kind of games they play.
Yeah, that's exactly.
And even as you ask that question, people don't ask those questions.
Right.
So it's easy to people just don't get that kind of critical in our analysis, and we have to help people develop. You got to ask questions. You have to scrutinize everything.
Mm-hmm. Especially if it's coming from the U.S. empire, and really based on what you're saying, it sounds like basically that old adage that the U.S. is just afraid of self-determination.
Right.
Like the U.S. can self-determine for you. We don't we don't want you to self-determine
exactly.
Yeah, which is of course not how that works, But so talk about a little bit the resistance to AFRICOM, and if there are movements both here and in Africa that are really combating this in a direct way.
Yeah, that's very hard. I mean, in just last year, there were people that really had a very massive demonstration in Ghana because the government of Ghana made some agreement with the United States to give access to other airfields and for the military and all that kind of stuff. And the people don't want. In fact, when AFRICOM was first established as a U.S. Africa Command, and that's what it stands for, people say it's U.S. Africa Command, it's the military presence of Africa, and they have these commands across the world. This one in Africa is called the U.S. Africa Command. It was established in 2008. It was established by the president, the George Bush administration established it, but it was widely rejected even by the leadership of the countries in Africa. They were trying to find a place to have its headquarters, and all of them were like, no, it was easier than, usually the world is duped by the duopoly kind of thing, where if it's a Republican or it's like this, then we should reject it. And so it was easy for the classes of what I refer to as the comprador class. I don't refer to them. That's the actual title. Like comprador classes in Africa to say, no, we don't want that. Right. From Bush, and everybody's talking about Bush, and he's easy to make fun of him. But then the same year, Obama comes into office. He's inaugurated, and then it's easy. Everyone's trying to open up and be, a black president of the United States. And there's probably hope. People are thinking that maybe this is a shift in even how the U.S. Deals with other countries' foreign policy, and in particularly Africa, And so they're allowing all kind of agreements. Before that happened, they end up having to settle on the headquarters of AFRICOM being in Stuttgart, Germany. So it's still there. They couldn't even put it there. And then there was only one country that was entertaining it. So there was like massive uprising against it. So once Obama comes into office, everything subsides, even from the people, because people think it. And so now we see like 1900% proliferation of what would be of a number of things that are considered AFRICOM. Military to military relationships are in all but one country, 53 out of the 54 countries in the continent of Africa. And as we understand it, Eritrea is that only one. And hopefully that will stay the case, but I don't, that they're really facing a whole, another thing when it comes to imperialism, trying to make sure they don't succeed and have self-determination. And then there's like special operations forces in so many countries, and military to military agreements, and all small military bases and what they call lily pad bases all over across the continent. So it's like really proliferated so much across the continent. The systemic analysis has to be broadened more and developed in terms of who holds the understanding that the root cause of the problem is capitalism and imperialism, and not this puppet government president who's been in power for 50 years or whatever. So there's a lot of actions against things like that. Get this president out, but then we're not talking about what we replace it with. We're not talking about the fact that it's not just this person who's in power that's the problem, but there's a reason that why this person is in power and can maintain power like that. And so until we really can broaden and that analysis does exist in a lot of the younger movements, like the Telema movement in the French-speaking countries, and like Burkina Faso and Congo, that are trying to collaborate with each other. I think once we can strengthen those kind of things, particularly the transcontinental collaborations in terms of them, then we can see some formidable resistance to AFRICOM.
Yeah, and you see the same thing here, like, oh, if we just impeach Trump, everything will be
It's
fine.
exactly. It's the same kind of thing.
Nope,
Impeach Trump was like, nah, that ain't.
Yeah, and then you get Mike Pence.
Right,
Congratulations.
exactly.
Like, what a,
Like,
what
that's
a great...
Somebody smarter.
Yeah, what a great improvement for everyone. That's fantastic. Yeah, and it also, I think another part of that is that, people here in the States don't know much, if anything, about AFRICOM, and B, the anti-war movement that was so like deadened by Obama's presidency, and that doesn't feel and feels detached from our perpetual wars, because they're not legitimate wars in the sense that Congress declared war, and it's just a perpetual, endless military-industrial complex, like free-for-all, basically, across the globe. So finally, I want to kind of wrap up on something else that you mentioned in a couple of your talks that I thought was really interesting, with regards to nonviolence, and it being not so much a principle but a tactic to be used when practical. I wondered if you could just speak to that a little bit, and with regards, particularly historically, in terms of AIM and Black Panthers, but also in present day.
What I want to say before what you just said, and this ties into it, is there's the military industrial complex. There's these industrial complexes, and one of them that also speaks to what we're about to talk about now is the media complex, and how we have media now that not just profits off of how they get information, but also has to facilitate the misinformation and the lack of analysis and all that we have during at some point throughout our movements here in the United States, but even outside, but particularly in the United States, there has been this, and when I think of media, I don't just think about the news media and whatnot, but everything, like the textbooks in schools and all, it's all media, right? It's been taught to us that the civil rights movement, not the Black Power movement, but the civil rights movement at that time was successful, that we advanced and there were some gains out of that. We don't talk about what there's not like strengths and weaknesses of it, or where we didn't advance. There's just, it was successful and there's some gains. It's along the path of progress, but also that success was tied to the fundamental principle of nonviolence, of the nonviolent movement. Dr. King is the symbol of the nonviolence, and that we have to be, and in it, the movements themselves and the people, even some of the people who were part of that movement, raised nonviolence up as a principle. That we must be nonviolent because we don't want to. It's a pacifist thing, right? And it's very selective, and they don't really even think about the contradictions or the hypocrisy on certain levels, and the fact that seamlessly there's a lot of times it's amenable to the powers that be for people to be nonviolent. However, it's ahistorical, and it doesn't deal with the forces of like nature and the universe. I say it's ahistorical in a sense that some of our, many of our movements that even could say had the most success, and all of them, even the nonviolent movements, Dr. King had a bodyguard who was armed, right? And so how do we, and that some of the propaganda focuses on like for example, when we talk about the Black Panther Party, they always leave off the rest of the name of the party, which was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, right? And so this is how they emerged, and a lot of our groups emerged that way. We don't talk about the Deacons of Defense or Robert Williams' NAACP chapter in Monroe, North Carolina, that believed in armed self-defense, that were actually successful through their politics and their campaigns to desegregate the swimming pool there, to free the young boys in the kissing case that were locked up, these little children, and so that, and even also the aspects of like the Black Panther Party that were creating alternative economy and government, like cooperatives and healthcare and education and feeding programs and those kind of things. And those were the paramount things. Those who you can't really, and so those were the things that are maligned and not looked at. And then every time you see the media depict people like either Malcolm X or the Black Panther Party, they seem like they're overly like they're overly wanting propensity for violence and want to they're just angry, and that's why it's not about us protecting ourselves or the success of being able to stand power to power with some arms or something and then fend off something that was getting ready to happen to somebody, which has happened. This has been the legacy of our movements, and we don't learn about them. And so I think this speaks to us if it speaks to the fact that if we take a position in the movement where we're always in a position of having to practice pacifism and nonviolence in the face of violence, then we, like Malcolm X speaks on this extensively, we disarm ourselves. And it's foolhardy to think that we should be subjecting ourselves to violence and putting ourselves in a position to plead for redress, to plead for equality or whatever the things that we should have as human rights from those who are inhumane and are actually denying us those rights. And so the only way we can get those things, one, we have to do it on equal footing, not being aggressors with anything, but actually being able to defend the outcomes of the principles and the decisions that we make, to be able to demand, no, you will not attack our community here. You will not send anyone in. And if you do, then you face the consequences. That has to be a principle. And so,
and I think that that's an important point too, that like people talk about violence when they're talking about self-defense, and even the law, like even the US's FACOCT law says that there's a difference, right? If you're acting in self-defense, that's all right. So there's a violence is poverty, violence is lack of access to healthcare, violence is systemic racism, violence is not defending you and your community. And so just that paradigm in and of itself.
Yeah, man, that's a good point, because it's actually the response or the outcome to violence being inflicted upon us.
Yeah. So with regards to your work, where should people go to find out more?
Work.
Your writing and your speaking at events.
I don't think much. I mean, the reason why I try was because I don't think that our movement is dependent on are people being organized and having to actually build up a collectivism versus an individualism, and it's not about personalities and all that kind of stuff. I'm part of an organization, Pan-African Community Action, and I think that's the most important, and also Black Alliance for Peace, which is two things. If people did want to read my writing, my name is pretty unique, and if you like do a web search, and I don't use that corporation, the name has become synonymous with with web searches. Do a web search of my name, and then you can find things, But I think what's most important is that people should look up organizations. They should realize that a lot of the people that we respect and admire throughout history that have raised up and contributed to our liberation struggle all belong to organizations. Every single one. Not one of them was just some individual doing things, because we can't do anything without organization. And the enemy and the adversaries are organized, and they induce a sort of individualism that makes us look at celebrity culture. And now we got people looking at what celebrities say about politics, and some of them don't know anything about what they're talking about. And I don't want to be throwing shade on people, but even with Pan-African Community Action, and I know this is your wrap-up question, man, is that internal to the organization, and I know other organizations do, and do it too, and it's indispensable, is that we have collective political education. So it's not just about our epiphanies about what there is. We study together inside, and we read stuff, and we look at films or whatever, and we discuss them. There's nothing like that, and it's an open, discussion, and we learn so much more. You can learn so much more through political education as an individual than you can by just reading a book or something by yourself. And it's also indispensable to our liberation. Liberation is a science, and we got to study science in order to understand it.